Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for a little bit more knife nerdery. And today we've got a really exciting one because this is the prototype of the Luft Concepts Avant. So huge thanks to Jake, aka Bearded Gear, aka one half of Luft Concepts, for sending this my way to check out. This is really exciting to me, in part because, I'm getting to check out a knife before it comes out. I've never gotten to do that before. That's incredible. In part also because this is the first time I remember seeing a true prototype. This is what Riate sends you if you get a prototype. And some companies will do slightly more versions of real, and some will cut some corners. Sometimes companies will do prototypes in a different steel, but Riate tends to do them as full-on production samples effectively. And since very little is going to change on this knife between this prototype and the production version coming out soon, this is effectively exactly the real knife. And it's just really neat to get to see all of these little details and what they like, or what they come like on a prototype. This also is just cool because, I'm not a huge channel, and this is after the prototype, the pre-sale came out, and so Jake sent this to me just because he, likes me and wants to hear what I have to think about the knife. And so this just means a lot, this isn't a publicity thing. It's just because he knew I wanted to check it out and he's nice. So huge thanks to Jake. Now, if you aren't familiar with what this is and what Luft Concepts is, Luft Concepts is a collaboration between Jake, like I just mentioned, and Ryan Rimmer of Rimmer Designs. Now, Ryan makes these EDC worry donuts. I'm not entirely sure what he calls them, maybe fidget donuts, but they're kind of like a cross between a worry stone and just a fidget object. And there are these sculpted made donuts made out of different materials that I'm guessing lathes? I honestly don't know how he makes them. I should ask him sometime. I should actually just talk to him sometime. I've never actually really had a conversation with Ryan. So anyway, the two of them are people that have spent a lot of time thinking about knives, and they bonded over partly that love. The other thing they bonded over is something we'll talk about when we get to where the name comes from. But this whole origin story is a good example of the fact that the knife reviewers you see on YouTube are just big, huge nerd knife enthusiasts just like you. And the whole way that this knife started is because Ryan just said, hey, Jake seems like my type of person. I'm going to go say hi to him and see, if we can spark a conversation. And they got talking. They got realized that they have a lot of overlap in terms of what they actually want out of a knife. And they both thought it'd be really cool to design a knife themselves. And so they decided to just try and do it themselves together as a collaboration. Ryan started with an initial design, and they kicked it over to Jake, and he made some tweaks, and they went back and forth, and eventually they got a 2D CAD design done, and eventually they got a friend to do a 3D CAD version and do a 3D printed version, let them feel it in hand. And that's so crucial to how this knife ended up and how it is, because this is the kind of knife that looks kind of surprising, but when you actually hold it in hand, that's when you realize that everything really is shaped the way it is for a reason. And so the fact that they were able to feel the 3D printed version gave them the confidence to know that this really was shaped the way they needed it to be, and make the kind of last minute changes they needed to that. A lot of people that get knives done through OEMs these days come to OEMs with basically kind of anywhere from a sketch to a 2D CAD. And the fact that they came in with full 3D CAD is an interesting approach. I want to go back though, because the name of this, and the other thing that they bonded over is they both had a shared passion for cars, and specifically German cars and the old air-cooled Porsches and stuff like that. And that's where this name comes from, because Luft is the German word for air. And I remember Jake saying that he used to go to, or maybe still does go to, a air-cooled Porsche meetup in California called, I think, Luftgekocht, which is the word for air-cooled. And they both really liked the kind of aesthetic of that era and that kind of design. And so that's something that they pulled both the name of the company for, and where the name for this knife comes from, because this is called the Avant. And the Avant, Avant is what Audi calls their, it's their word for basically a wagon or a hatchbacky type shape. And so they thought that this handle design kind of felt reminiscent of the hatchback curves on the Avant lines of Audi. And so that's where that name came from too. And they've said that concept of like vintage German car silhouettes is what their main design language inspiration is intending to be going forward too. So I think this is going to come up in other places. As far as this logo, that is the Alchemy logo for Air. And so this whole thing is just a very Air-centric branding. And honestly, it just looks really cool. And since Luft, Air, all of that is just like a pretty neutral concept and also can refer to like as light as air. It's a very light knife. It works really well as just a general brand, even if you're not a car enthusiast and don't know any of that origin story. So let's start talking about the knife itself, and let's talk about this blade. Because this blade is interesting. This is one of the things that immediately caught my eye because it stands out. This looks different. It looks familiar in some dimensions to other things you've seen, but in some ways it certainly doesn't. A lot of people have drawn analogies to the Spyderco PM2 and the Koenig Arius, and that is obviously not a surprise, and that is clearly intentional. Those are some of Jake's absolute favorite knives, as he has said many times on his channel, and same thing with Ryan. They both love those knives. And so what they've done here is pulled design inspiration and elements of those and said, well, why do I like those? It's not just I want to make something that looks like that. Why do I actually like those aspects of those knives? Both of those tend to have this kind of upswept thumb ramp right here. And this is one of the most prominent things about this knife. So right off the bat, let's talk about that. This is completely flat back here. There's no jimping. And if you've ever listened to Jake talk about knives, he hates jimping that doesn't need to be there. And I completely agree with him. I'm of the mindset that good ergonomic design is almost always sufficient and better than any kind of jimping would ever be. Jimping is usually kind of like a caveat excuse for if you've not done a good job of making it so the knife will just stay placed in your hand. And a thumb ramp like this that is smooth and comfortable is such a better way of achieving that same kind of effect. Yeah, not every knife should do this. Not every knife are going to want to do this, but man, it's a great way of giving you this incredibly locked in feeling. And it's just so comfortable. It's so nice and smooth to put your finger here, and yet you definitely feel like you're not going to go anywhere. You can put a lot of force behind that. I'm going to talk about the handle and everything more later, but in this more choked up grip, my thumb just fits here absolutely perfectly. And then if I pull this back and cant it more into like a more of a hammer grip, my thumb still sits here and just rests in this in exactly the way I'd want. There is this really nice chamfer here on both sides. And generally speaking, there's nice chamfers everywhere, but it means that this just feels really, really good as you work your way around it. As we come up to the top though, that's when this suddenly becomes a crowned spine. And I love crowned spines. I think they look really classy, but they most of all just feel so nice. And since this is also the kind of knife that you're going to want to hold in a pinch grip, being able to put your finger up here, whether you're choked back with your fingers in here and your finger right at the top, or all the way forward, your finger more towards the tip, putting your finger along this spine just feels so great. You'll notice that this stays a relatively thick edge all the way out to the tip. This is a reasonably robust tip, and the reason has to do with this hollow grind. We'll talk more about that in a second, but the basics of this is that this is the kind of hollow grind that stays really, really thin for really high, and then kind of swells up all at the end. And so the result is that even though this, I don't know what you call this, clipping point, I don't know. Even though that this comes decently far into this hollow grind, the hollow grind itself is still relatively thick at that point and is not decreasing super, super fast yet. And so that's why this is able to stay as thick as it is out to the end. Now, this hollow grind is absolutely insane. We have to talk about this because this is really, really, really impressively thin. They said that they asked Ricasso to hit a target of 15 thousandths behind the edge, and they said that that's the reason they went for a hollow grind rather than like a full flat. That they said that between the thickness of the stock that they wanted to get and the thinness behind the edge that they were targeting, they said that a hollow grind is really the only way to get there. But honestly, and they said they're aiming for 15 thousandths, and they said that then that's what they're advertising it as. But this is even thinner than that. On my calipers, I'm measuring this at about 11 thousandths behind the edge, and in fact, it doesn't hit 15 thousandths behind the edge until 1/4 of an inch up this blade. And so this is exceptionally thin out here. I posted that video recently about the Trevor Berger LEXK and how incredibly impressive that hollow grind is. And this is actually very similar feeling. It's not quite as aggressive because it doesn't go up quite as far, but this is another knife that has that very rare, very tall hollow grind. A lot of hollow grinds aren't that tall. And so this is one of those things that really does feel incredibly thin this entire way. And the result is that even though this knife has been passed around by a bunch of other folks that Jake knows, and this edge is not like shaving sharp anymore, although it's actually pretty darn close, this is the kind of geometry that just absolutely melts through cardboard. Even if this edge were dull, this is so incredibly thin that it just glides through from a geometry alone. So like this is an exceptional slicing knife. The blade stock up here is 0.14. I think it might be 0.0138, you know, the way it's like maybe 3.5 millimeters. I forget. But the point is that even though that's relatively thick and on the thicker, for me, by my standards of an EDC knife, this is not thick stock by like normal knife standards. That's very, very normal. But by my standards of a thin slicey EDC knife, that's on the thicker end. But because of how aggressive and how thin this stays for so long, this is the kind of thing that even with that blade stock, this is one of the sliciest knives through something like cardboard that I've ever seen. I said in my unboxing video that I was curious if we were going to encounter any kind of drag at the top, because this entire bar along the top is the full thickness, because this is part of the flat. And this hole cutout comes down below that grind line, which means it's thinner down here than it is up here. That's pretty uncommon to do. And as a result, it's thinner right here than it is right here. And I was curious whether or not something like really thick 2 or 3 walled cardboard would come up here, not be pushed out any further, and then hit into this. And I did not experience that whatsoever. I think it's theoretically possible, but again, it just didn't happen in practice. But also there is this delightful transfer, as I'm talking about transfers and everywhere, which would mean that if material did hit this, it would kind of get pushed out like a ramp. Talking more about this blade shape, it's interesting because you don't see a lot of blade shapes like this in terms of the actual edge profile. There is a tremendous amount of basically full flat, and then a very deep belly that's all concentrated at the tip. And as a result, it's kind of reminiscent of maybe like almost a Japanese tanto. The Japanese tantos are the kind that have a rounded transition rather than a sharp angle like American tantos. This isn't actually a tanto, and this is because this is just all curve right here. It's not actually a flat surface, but the result is that you can actually use this edge, this corner down here, lack of a better word, as kind of like a corner there. On a tanto blade, you can use that secondary tip to pierce in and cut open. And while it's not quite as easy to do that with because you don't have such a defined point that you're trying to enter in, it still really does work that way. And so I tried opening a bunch of different Amazon boxes and stuff like that to see how well I could use this to puncture in and pull back. And it works really, really well. And that's important because this tip does come up higher. Like this isn't higher than like your standard drop point knife, but it does come up higher enough that to bend this all the way up to get to actually use the real tip isn't the most convenient thing in the world, the way it would be on any kind of drop point knife, but it's not so high up that it's actually hard. It's still pretty easy to get past that belly, but it's a thick and robust enough, like a wide enough belly that you do kind of have to turn your hand to get to the actual tip. So it's nice that you can use this as a secondary cutting corner. As far as this hole shape right here, from a like aesthetics perspective alone, it catches a lot of people's eye because it's a very, very large hole. But that we're going to talk about that in the action, in the sense that that gives you a lot of different ways that you can open the knife, and just ways you can hold it, and places you can apply pressure. And so that's actually really, really nice. From a like a shape perspective, this line here and that line here is basically mirroring the lines we have here on the knife. And so aesthetically, it kind of is a nice, fun tie-in. Like I said, we've got this really, really nice chamfer around the entire inside surface, but it's more than just that, because sometimes even if you have this kind of 45-degree chamfer, and especially on knives that have a satin blade finish, this edge will still be crisp enough that even though it's 45 and not 90, it still will scrape my nail. And what I have found is that this is actually very pleasant. It's not hard. Like, I have that video up of taking another 45-degree chamfered satin finish Reate knife, the Urban EDC supply company Vox F5.5, and needing to file this down. And I don't need to do that at all here. Part of that is also having to do with the strength of this detent and how you just don't need to apply a ton of pressure, but I can run my finger off this and it doesn't scrape it at all. And that's just really, really cool. The last thing I wanted to talk about this, well, no, that's not true. So this part right here is called the Ricasso. That's the full thickness of the blade that comes up past the handle and before this this plunge grind. And I've had some people comment to me that they thought that this looks like it stuck out farther than they would have expected. And honestly, that was kind of my initial reaction too. And yeah, aesthetically, that might not be your favorite thing, but it has a really important functional side effect. And that's making this pseudo choil really, really comfortable. Again, I'll talk about this more when I get into the handle, but if you look at what's going on here, this front pit that you can choke up into that effectively works like a choil, even though it's rounded the opposite direction of your standard choil, you're pressing on the full thickness of this blade with these really delightful chamfers again that make this super duper comfortable. If they had pulled this back and made this like cut in like a more standard choil, then you wouldn't have such a nice, smooth, and wide surface for you to press against. And so from a comfort perspective, this is really, really nice. But talking about that plunge grind, this is one of the few things on this knife that I don't think they perfected. So many little details in this knife have been dialed in, but this is one of the things that I hope is slightly different on the actual versions here. Because what we have is, first of all, not much in the way of a sharpening choil from a depth perspective. I don't know if this knife has been sharpened. Like I said, this has gone around to quite a few people at this point. I haven't heard anyone say they sharpened it, just stropped it, but it's possible. So maybe this is the result of having already been sharpened. I don't know, but you can tell that it just doesn't have a lot of vertical height this direction from the edge of the blade until you get up to this thicker part up here. But the bigger thing is that this plunge grind just isn't quite aggressive enough. You can see from the way that the light is bending on it, let's see if I can get that to kind of go, that this, the plunge grind, the thing is taking it from the full thickness down to the thinnest behind the edge, is just a little bit slower than I'd want it to see and doesn't really end until we get right there to the bottom. So I would have liked to have seen a more aggressive plunge grind that dropped off quicker and gave us this more sharpening room. And you can kind of see the effect of this already. Let's see if I can get that to show. Maybe if I zoom in. So you can see right now that instead of a smile coming upward, we have that kind of slight extension of the blade down. And that's the same concept. It's the smile being shown by the fact that as you're working your way up at the same angle, up a wider surface, that it becomes thicker. But that thickness, instead of going up, is coming down because they've kept the grind line the same. Yeah. So speaking of grind lines, the very last thing I think I want to talk about this blade, I might change that in my mind later, is just what these finishes are. Yeah, again, if you've ever heard Jake talk about his preferences in knives, you'll know that he loves a satin, a belt like a machine satin finish, a belt satin finish. And Riate in particular is known for having these really clean, refined, straight, beautiful belt satins. And this is honestly just a fantastic example of it. I tend to be someone that likes stonewash finishes best of all because they are user finishes, and I want a knife to feel as usable as possible, so that I don't have any apprehension of using it, even if it's really, really nice. But this is the kind of thing where a machine satin or a belt satin here just really does look gorgeous and shows off that hollow grind really, really well. Let's see if I can get the light to catch that, because as you roll the reflections over it, you can see the curvature of the blade. Ooh, yeah, that kind of shows it. And man, it really just is gorgeous. The flats are a hand satin flats. And when you're doing the flats of a knife as opposed to hand satin on something like the hollow grind itself, that's typically done not by taking sandpaper in your hand and rolling over the knife while the knife is fixed. That's more done by having a big sheet of sandpaper and taking the knife itself and sliding it up and down on that. And so what you get though is these really pretty grind lines going in this direction along the top that are really like just delicate and beautiful, and then almost equally delicate and beautiful grind lines coming down this way. And so while it's not normally my favorite finish on a knife, it is a really, really nice version of this. And so I'm really glad that that's what this is coming in. And this is in fact the version that I ended up ordering. I should have talked about that at the beginning. But anyway, this is the overall spec that I got. I think that's everything I want to talk about this knife, blade itself. Yeah, let's talk on about the handle. So the handle shape is again the kind of thing that stands out to people. It has a big kind of swell right here. It has a big intake right here. It's got a sharp back, and this is one of the things that makes this sharp as like a decline. I don't mean sharp that anything is hard or crisp or rubbing against you. And that's one of the things that makes people compare this to Strider, because it's common for Strider knives, like one of their main design elements, to have a kind of a slope here and then a distinct corner and then a slope here. Yeah, so both Jake and Ryan like Strider knives, but the bigger thing is that there's the reason for having this is functional, because man, it fits into your palm in exactly the right ways that you would want. And this slope right here means that you can curl your fingers up into this. If you're doing a pinch grip, this just fits so incredibly comfortably in your hand. This curvature goes right into this, I don't know what you want to call that, but that swell into your palm right there, and it just feels so locked in. Again, similarly, this part right here, if you're holding it choked back here, this feels just like tremendously comfortable. It's almost like a guard again, where you can't slide forward. And then if you choke up, you're going to end up putting your forefinger up here and wrapping these around. And sometimes it can feel kind of odd if a knife has a big difference between this dimension and this dimension, because you're not normally used to putting weight down with your middle finger below this. But this feels so just secure and locked in and like, yeah, you just really, it feels incredibly comfortable. All of these curves just kind of fit the way that your hand wants to curve around it. And so every time that I've shown this to someone, since in the time that I've had it, they always make comments about the shape. And my response is immediately, I see that, but I'm telling you, once you have it in hand, it's perfect. Like all of those things just make so much intuitive sense the moment you feel it. And that's one of the things that I love about a knife, is when it just kind of, it makes sense for the ways that you want to hold it. I often really like contouring on handles, and this is one of those knives that just effectively kind of has flat slabs, and that again is not surprising given how much influence Spyderco has had on Jake in his knife career, because that's a thing that they typically do. But in a handle like this, especially with it getting kind of thinner right here, that flat surface makes it stay really, really secure in your hand and not feel at all like it has any opportunity to twist. And it also gives you just a really good kind of indexing point. You can feel that plane and feel how it's oriented in your hand immediately. There's no guessing about how you're holding the knife. And so this is the kind of knife that you can spin around in your hand a whole bunch and just kind of like play with and like twirl it, and not have any ambiguity about how you're holding it. And it's just so, it's one of those knives that is really clearly designed to be usable. And that's part of that. The fact that you can immediately tell how you're holding it is, no matter what kind of way you're gripping it, is part of that usability. I'm not someone who normally cares about how knives hold in other grips because I don't typically hold knives in other grips. The most common one I might do is a reverse draw cut, because I might like stab into a bag of soil or something in my yard. I do a lot of yard work and pull back. Or just a reverse grip if I'm like cutting rope or something like that. Those are the two most common that I might kind of do, and it feels really good in both of those. This sometimes when you have like a big pronounced thing up here, that can feel weird, but the reality is even if you somehow choke up, this is curved enough that this just feels really, really nice. Realistically, I would hold it more like this. And yeah, again, it just feels really, really nice. As far as the shape here and acts as this lock bar, it's like perfect. I know that I feel like I'm raving just a whole bunch about this. And the reality is this just works really, really well. You have a recessed axis on this side and this really nice chamfer here. And one of the things that I've just been really impressed with about this knife is just how exceptionally easy and simple it is to get in here and unlock this knife. It's just so immediate and intuitive. I'm not great at thumb flicking knives, so if I'm messing that up, but it's just so immediately and intuitive. And it's I never feel like I'm slipping off of it. It just works tremendously well in that regard. Also, the micarta on this is really, really nice. I don't know for certain, but I believe this is the American kind of micarta. It sure as heck looks like it. And the result is that it has this really nice texture. You can see what color it comes right off the bat, but this takes on oils in this really, really nice way and gets this wonderful kind of smoothness to it that is grippy but smooth at the same time. I love the micarta on this, and I'm very glad they did it in a black micarta version. Love it, love it, love it. The last thing I want to talk about with these handles is that there's just really nice rounding everywhere. One of the things that they said that they're looking to do different between the prototypes and this is they said they wanted to get the finishing on the inside of the micarta to be as nice as finishing on the outside. I'm not 100% sure what they mean by that. They might mean a very subtle chamfer here, or maybe just kind of some oil on that. But the reality is this rounding on the outside is just delightful. It feels like kind of melted in this wonderful way. And so there's no sharp corners anywhere. And that is another thing that, again, shouldn't be surprising when you look at who designed this, because Jake is always someone that notices if there are sharp, jaggy points anywhere, and that's along the lines with that concept of jimping. Now, I haven't talked yet about this flipper tab. And that is something that is going to come up right now with how this handle fits, because look at this. This is one of the coolest things about this knife. This flipper tab hides in right here into the handle. And they're not the first person that's ever done a hidden flipper tab in this way. It's reminiscent of other flipper tabs that lean forward and are going up forward that end up sitting flat. But it's a pretty uncommon thing to find still, and it works so nicely. When you do find a knife that has that, it works so good for just being able to like hold the knife in this choked up way. Because if there was ever this jabby flipper tab sticking out down the bottom, you wouldn't be able to get up there, and you would just never have that same level of control. I think it's time to finally start talking about the action in this knife, and this is something that's really cool because this flipper tab works tremendously well. This is one of the things that they're planning on changing a little bit. The feedback they got from everyone, and I would have given it to them had they not already heard it a billion times and already agreed to change it, is that this corner right here is a little bit jabby. So they've lobbed this back just the slightest bit to make it so that it's more comfortable to do a push on the corner kind of push buttony action. But when I say it works really, really well, what I mean is that this is a deep in, forward leaning, forward facing, low profile flipper tab. And these are the kind of flipper tabs that are my favorite. because this is the exact opposite of what Shabazz would call a pocket pecker. When you have your hand sliding down into your pocket, this is the kind of thing where you slide right over this and there's no jabbiness. Your hand glides right past it, and anything that was in your pocket would come up here, and there's nothing sharp here. There's no need for jimping, because what you're instead relying on is this flat surface at the front that you're able to pull back on, and it works tremendously well. Having a low and short flipper tab allows you to maintain, and a forward-facing flipper tab allows you to maintain contact for a longer period of time, all in the direction that you're wanting to do. If the flipper tab is coming up further out here, it's harder to maintain contact the entire path as you go down. And so this is the kind of thing that lets you push kind of down as you go and kind of pull your finger back in like a true appropriate light switch. And it means that even though this detent is not tremendously strong, you can get such a freaking good flick. But this is the kind of flipper tab design that means that you can get a really good flick even if you don't have a detent at all. And to show that, it's not that this doesn't have any detent, but this is one of the 20 CV versions of the Spyderco Smock, and this one has like an exceptionally light detent. But it has the same general concept of a forward-leaning, far up and sitting up this direction flipper tab. And because of this, the way that works, and the way that you get to pull down and maintain contact the entire way, even though this has such a light detent, and you can like really, really easy fail it, you can also get a tremendously forceful thwack. And it's all about the angle you're able to apply pressure, the fact that you're able to maintain contact for so long, and that general geometry of how the flipper tab works. This is yet another knife, by the way, that's able to kind of hide its flipper tab because of the fact that it is so forward like that. Veros and what are the other versions, they're doing it by having this be a compression lock and moving the entire lock back of the bar to the top. These folks are doing it in a way more clever way by pulling the lock bar up in this interesting way that we'll talk about when we look inside. Before we get to that, let's talk about the action on this knife and also the sounds. Are you hearing this? I don't know how well this is going to truly come through because these are very high frequencies, and I don't know how well my mic will pick this up. But this is the kind of knife that absolutely sings. I cannot tell you just how much this goes ting. It is spectacular. It is music to my ears. And it's entirely because of this blade shape. This thin hollow grind here, it stays so thin for so long that it works like a tuning fork. And it's just, it makes these really nice ringing noises. And man, it is a pleasure to hear. Yeah, it just sounds so good. I love the way this sounds. Okay, I'm gonna stop. I have to move on. It's just so distracting. I love it so much. The action on this works really, really well from a lot of different deployment methods. And this is one of those things that just becomes really, really fidgety as a result. I'm not great at thumb flicking knives because thumb flicking knives that have a hole. I just tend to find it harder to hold them in my hand in a way that gives me the kind of grip that I need. But this is like tremendously easy to do. Yeah, really, really easy to do. So it works really well from that regard. It works tremendously well as a flipper. And the thing though is that both of those, while available options, are obviously not how what this is primarily designed for. This is so clearly a middle finger flicking knife. And in that regard, I love this. It works so freaking well. Now, this is the kind of knife that has it's not that it has a weak detent. This is a pretty medium detent, I would say, but the fact that you are able to come so low down on this means that your lever arm distance is so high that when you're applying that force down here, it can feel kind of weak. The average knife has their detent, has their place that you press on, like the thumb stud of the hole, all the way up here. And if you do press up here, this is actually kind of firm, like on the firmer side for sure. But the thing is that you can do all the way down here, and it's definitely weaker down there. And so I remember watching in like Lefty's first impressions on this, Lefty EDC, that he thought that this had a lighter detent than he wanted. And I personally think this is basically perfect. It's not going to be the kind of thing where you can just kind of like, actually, hell, it's pretty hard to fail this for me. But it's not gonna be the kind of thing where like the detent is so strong that any attempt to break it is gonna make it open. Like you see, it didn't lock up all the way there. But the geometry of how you hold this and where you can flick it and how you can put your finger in here and how easy it is to get your finger into here, and how the width here, meaning that you can really easily be pressing on this inside surface instead of pressing upward, you can press outward, means that flicking this knife is effortless. And you can flick it all the way from the top. You can flick it all the way from the bottom. You can flick it like out as opposed to flicking it up. You can flick it with like using the meat of your finger, and they all just work really, really well. Given that Jake is let me see if I can find one of those stickers. Yeah. Given that Jake's whole thing is holes over studs, holes are greater than studs, obviously he was going to make a knife that he co-designed be a hole knife and be middle finger flickable. And he knocked it out of the park in that regard in terms of just how incredibly easy and fun this is to middle finger flick. Now let's talk about closing action. Now, this is not ever going to be the kind of knife that is super, 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 super free fall. The biggest reason for that has to do with how light this blade is. This blade is really, really thinned out. So even though it has this thicker blade stock, it's a very light knife. And so if you disassemble this and you just kind of hold the blade in your hand, it feels very light. And so that means that there's not a lot of weight to counter any frictional force from this lock bar as you go. And this lock bar has to be a little bit strong. We'll talk about that in terms of the placement when we look inside the knife. But the result is that this has to be kind of strong. This is not hard to push over by any means, but it's not one of those lock bars you push over and go like, wow, that was really weak. And so the result is that there is friction pushing on this as you go, and this blade is just not heavy enough to do that, to pull past that. But it's so smooth that when you do try to close it, it's just the tiniest little bits of shake. And if you try and close it with any kind of real gusto, it's so easy to do. But you might notice something that's happening right here. Yeah, do you see that? Even from the moment I get up on here, I'm just pushing it close. And that's because this knife has a perfect detent ball ramp. We'll talk about that too when we look inside, but the bottom line is that this detent ball ramp is that kind that I rave about, where there's absolutely no bump up onto the detent ball, onto the ramp, and then you can effectively not tell. It's extremely hard to tell. It's right about there that you can tell when you actually leave the ramp. And it's because of the length of it. And again, we'll talk about that when we take it apart. But the bottom line is that closing this knife, even though I am the type of person that does this and then that all the time, this is one of those knives that's actually extremely fun to just kind of glide home with your finger the entire way. And especially because there is this notch, it just kind of works. Yeah. This is just really nice to do. Now, the other part about the closing action is that like it does this. And I did just show that, but man, so this is one of those things that when you do push this out, this flows so smoothly. Those bearings are good. They did they ride a track into the steel washers that we'll look at on the inside. And as a result, this just falls to your nail really, really effortlessly. Now, talking more about this action, I will talk about one more thing about the way that this notch on back here on this like slope on the back of the blade is, and that's that there's not a lot of space back here. When you're middle finger flicking, one of the most common ways to do that is to hold this in your hand in this kind of grip, and you have the back anchored back here, and there's a pretty narrow spot that you're trying to anchor against your back. And so what I have found to be the case is that if my hand is slippery for some reason, and the number one reason where that happens is if I just washed my hands and so they're still a little bit wet, I find that because there's not a whole lot going on back here, really the only thing anchoring against the back is this pocket clip. And so since this is this kind of like really rounded version on the prototype, it can kind of slide forward in my hand a little bit. And this is the kind of knife that's so easy to flick open that you don't need to be gripping the knife real hard. But I do find that it's just the littlest bit slippery back here. And I've noticed that on basically any other knife that I have that also comes down to like a relatively thin point. Knives that have a wider spot back here just provide more friction. But one of the very few things that's going to change between this and the production run is the shape of this clip slightly. Due to kind of manufacturing reasons, they ended up having to make this clip be a little bit more squared off, kind of like more akin to, say, this. So the production run of this is going to have a clip that looks slightly more like that at the end, and I don't think it really is going to make much of a functional difference for the most part, but the reality is that this slight bit more of a corner here will make that grip just a little bit more. But I've thought a lot about this, especially when I heard that that was happening, and held this in my hand and held this in my hand in the exact same spot where it hits. And since they're going to be pretty much the same, I don't think that that corner bit is going to make any impact whatsoever as far as like hot spot or something like that. And with that regard, this clip feels really, really fantastic in my hand. You do feel it like you will anyone. And I was worried that because this is so high up on the edge here, that I would feel this pressing into my hand, since my hand's not going to have any kind of buffer of the handle to kind of push it out. But I don't. I mean, I do feel it, but it doesn't feel bad. It feels really, really nice. Talking about this clip itself, yeah, like I said, it's going to change slightly there, but otherwise this clip is going to be basically the same as this, and I love this clip. It's not like it's a absolutely perfect clip, but it's almost a perfect clip. It's pretty darn similar to the clip that's on, for example, like my Ace Riv, and that's one of my absolute favorite knives to slide in and out of my pocket because this clip just works so well. And again, the clip choice is another thing where, like, if you've heard Jake ramble about what he loves out of knives, obviously he's going to put a wire clip on because this knife is so designed to be function. I'm not going to say function over form, although some people will certainly phrase that, and I've heard of people say that. It's just to be high function. And wire clips like this just work really, really well. This has excellent ramp, it has excellent clearance, and there is, of course, some really, big irony that Jake is very aware of, the fact that on a knife that he himself co-designed, the clip doesn't come all the way up to the tip. What does stick out of your pocket is that. And so one of the benefits of this coming in at an angle and a slope is that there's just almost nothing coming out of the back, and it doesn't really look so much like a knife. Now, if this were me, and if I were designing this, I would have prioritized this higher over this slope being quite as aggressive as it is. I would have made this slope less sloped, have this come out a little bit further, make this a little bit wider, and make it so there was room to push this all the way up to the end. That's if I were designing this knife, but I didn't design this knife. And the reality is that the slope back here, like I said, in its form, nestles your hand perfectly. So I don't know, maybe if I felt that in hand and had this in hand too, maybe I wouldn't have made that trade-off. But even though it doesn't go all the way up to the butt end, it comes pretty darn close. And so I don't mind that whatsoever. And carrying this has been a dream. This thing is very light. The entire thing slides that way. Even though it's relatively tall in this dimension compared to some knives that I carry, like the Waypoint, this does kind of disappear in my pocket a lot more than I expected. And that's one of the other side effects of this backspacer and this slope at the back, is that when you go to put your hand in, you glide over this and it feels really, really nice. So you just kind of come down. And yeah, so having this in my pocket felt pretty delightful. While we're talking about carry, let's talk about the weight, because this is one of the things that's really impressive. This knife, especially given that it has full tie liners, is really surprisingly light. This is a 3.3 inch blade, just under, maybe 3.28, but the knife itself weighs only maybe 2.96 ounces, something just under 3. And that is putting it in that really below an ounce an inch mark that makes something feel quite light. But I want to be clear that it doesn't feel like hollow. It still feels very sturdy. Sometimes when knives get so light for their size, they feel almost scary light, like you might break or bend them, and also like you don't quite feel like it's in your hand. And this is, I'm going to go as far as to say, for some people, if you want heft, this might be too light for you. But the vast majority of people who are looking for an EDC knife, which again is 100% what this is supposed to be, they're going to love how incredibly just light this is. It disappears in your hand in a way. It's that kind of thing where it feels incredibly nimble. It doesn't feel fragile, but it just is surprisingly light. Oh, one of the things that is going to change between the prototype and the full production version is the finishing of this hardware. So the back part here has this kind of blasted, almost stonewashy, I'm not really sure, but a matte finish. And regardless of how they're achieving that, they said that they've requested that the production versions have that same kind of finish on the pivot and screws and the clip. And I've actually never seen that. I've never seen a wire clip with a matte finish like that. So I'm really curious to see how that comes out, because they've always been this kind of shiny look. But matte finish on this is going to make it be even more kind of stealthy, because it's just going to make it not reflect light. And so that's going to be even more of like a discreet carry. And I think that that'll be a nice aesthetic tie-in everywhere like that. Of course, on the other variant of this, all those things are PVD coded, so who cares? The other thing they're going to do is they're going to add another one of these screws right there just to kind of fill this spot in. I don't know if I'll actually leave it in. I might take that out. It's completely cosmetic and it's just there to fill that hole. And I kind of think I prefer it without the extra hole, the screw there, so that it is obviously optional. The only other thing that is changing between this and the production version is that this logo, the Luft Concepts logo there, is going to be turned vertically so that when you're holding it, it looks like that. And I think I saw a mock-up of that. I don't remember, but it makes total sense that you would do that. I think that kind of feels a little bit more natural. So what we have going on inside is pretty straightforward from a components perspective, except it's, well done versions of everything. They've made the right choices. Where things are going to get really interesting is when we talk about the geometry of all of this stuff and how they're getting this flipper tab to hide. To start off with, we have titanium liners, which my understanding is they are a carbidized lock face, I believe so, in a micarta scale. And these are nested liners, which means that the scale wraps around all the way. And one of the things that makes Riate's version of nested liners kind of stand out is just how clean and tight this alignment is. It's actually kind of difficult to get these liners out. I didn't bother trying. There's no real reason to do so, but Jake did that in his disassembly video, and it's such a nice tight fit. And that's something you'll see on Riate a lot. There's individually the serialization on these, because these are going to be numbered, at least the first batch, is going to occur right here. Instead of the word Avant prototype, it's going to say Avant and like the number. And you also notice that your blade steel designation is in there as well. We've got a backspacer over here that is threaded. So if you were to strip one of these screws threading here and you stripped the backspacer rather than the screw, it's just that one component that would need to be replaced. So that's pretty easy to do. I think it's very unlikely that you're going to strip these screws, because one of the nice things about Riate is that they have absolutely exceptional hardware. The engagement here is very deep. It's very crisp. This fits on the end of the bit very, very well. And then the actual threading on these is just exceptional. So I think it's very unlikely you're going to strip these, but some people make mistakes. This another thing is that there is this backspacer pin right here. And that helps with lining up the whole knife before you get this in, because you don't have this backspacer, the ability for it to just kind of like loosely flow around. Let's say you took out all of the screws, but for disassembly alone, you don't have to take out the screws on the other side. You can leave this attached like I did. This pin is, as far as I can tell, identical to the backspace, wow, I'm blanking. The stop pin, they seem to be interchangeable, but you can tell which is which just because this one has more wear to it. And basically that's because this slides easily in and out of here, but this is a pretty tight compression fit. And that's good because you don't want this to rattle around and you don't want it to move about you don't want it to have play basically. And the fact that it's a nice tight compression fit is another sign of it being Riate. These are titanium liners, and so you will see that there is a steel raceway washer, and these already have a good amount of a track wearing in. That's nice to see. And so if you do take these washers out, they're currently being held in with that interstitial capillary tension that holds washers together if you put a drop of lube on the other side. But if you do end up taking that out, you'll just want to put the washer side with the race already on it facing back towards the washers. What else do we got? So these are our pivot and bearings. And what's noteworthy here is that this is a 3/16 inch pivot. That's noteworthy only because this is a Chinese manufactured knife, and often Chinese manufactured knives are going to be 5mm, but this is 3/16. So if you want to get something like a skiff bearing, you can get that in the 3/16 inch size, and it will indeed have very nice tight fitment. But honestly, these are great washers. These are great bearings. As far as the stamped kind of cage bearings go, these are great. What makes them great is just that they flow very smoothly. I've never had one of these from Riate have any kind of dead balls where it's been pinched slightly. And so while you will get some stability improvement and you'll get better fitment for sure. I mean, if you look at this and you can see the way that this wobbles, and you will get the fact that the closed bearings won't let gunk form, but from like a smoothness of action and from like a free fallingness, you're not going to see really any improvement because these are very nice in terms of how they move. The other thing about this pivot, this is the kind of captive pivot that has a D-shaped slot on just one side. And first things first, every single knife should have a captive pivot. That is a hill I will absolutely die on. And this style is my second favorite way of doing it. My least favorite way, the most common way and the easiest for companies to do, is to just make this D shape go across the entire barrel. And the reason why I don't like that is because if you look at what that will look like you can imagine we stuck this in here, this is what it will appear like at the end result. And you'll see that little gap right there. And so that gap, if it goes across the entire pivot, that's going to be what you're on when you're actually down here and the knife is in the right spot, the blade's in the right spot. And that gap can get gunk in it. That gap can easily collect dust, and that dust can get wedged on the side that's a really pretty easy place to cause friction in the system. So in this one, since it's only on the edge, when you are in the spot that you actually would be on the blade, there's nice, clean, tight alignment all the way throughout. And because this is Riate, this is very good fitment. There's no wobble here. One of the side effects of this style of D-shaped pivot with just the notch is that it means that you can't change the directionality of how it goes in. It can only go in on one side because it will only fit through on the other side. And the other downside to it is that it can make it a little bit harder to put together the knife because this has to align a very specific way. On knives that don't have a internal stop pin, it's a little bit easier because you can kind of hold the scale slightly to the side, catch it on the D shape, and then twist the entire pivot. I don't find there's any real problem with disassembling this because this is such a reasonably tight fit in here that if you put this in when you're assembling it and you just turn it to the right direction, it will stay in place pretty well. And so you just need to line it up with that facing towards the center of the knife because there is the corresponding notch. And you'll notice that that is just on the liner. It's not on the scale. That's still a round cut. my absolute favorite way to do a D-shaped pivot is what you'll find over here on like the Herman Sting, where something about this is not the Sting, this is the Vespertilio, where something about the shape of the pivot itself is what keeps it captive, and in a way that is like really quite strong. Like this cannot turn because it's held in by all of these lobes, and you're not going to strip that. The other way you'll see this kind of the shape of the pivot is what's holding it captive type thing is something like what Civivi does, and those work by having a small notch in the scale material itself that is holding into a corresponding notch on the pivot, and that doesn't work quite as well because it's not as strong because you're relying on the material of the scale to not strip out. And so if there's a lot of Loctite, and your scale is made of something like, I don't know, softer wood or even like micarta or something that's not quite as hard, you do run the risk of stripping that little bit of the scale out. And so this is my favorite kind. And this is my second favorite kind because you get that full I've talked about. However, this D shape and the fact that you can't swap what side it's on is going to make the next part kind of a little bit harder to do, because what I'm going to transition to now is showing how this geometry all works, and I can only assemble this with the and to do that I need to use this lock side, and I can only assemble this with this sticking in here. If this weren't one of these single-sided D-shaped pivots, I could stick the pivot up through this and then kind of stack everything on top, and it's not going to be quite that easy to do. You'll see in just a second. But before I do that, I want to point out this. We do have an internal stop pin, the kind that travels through this smile-shaped arc, and the placement of this we'll talk about in a moment. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that we've got a really nice track milled in. So that's one of the things that Riate does, is they actually mill a starter track for your ball to go in. This isn't just from the ball running on it. And then we also have these countersunk areas here, I guess counterboard areas here for the bearing to sit in. What's nice about this is that means that the bearing can sit submerged in. That partly what that's doing is making it so the knife can be thinner, because the entire thing has less horizontal space that needs to stack, or I guess vertical space in this case. I'm just looking at it weird because I'm under the camera. But the other thing is that it means that if you do use the stock bearing, something that is open caged like this, you can place that side in, and that will help prevent gunk from getting into it, because gunk would have to go around this very small crevice on the outside in order to get up into the inside. So it's nice to be able to see that. And the fact that this blade is thick enough, this is 0.14, that's correct, means that they have plenty of room to cut these down. I think I measure these at 0.03 as a sink, which is why you're able to get exactly lined up, practically perfect, flush with the top of these bearings. I guess before I talk about all that, I'm also going to talk about this. So this is the Detent ball ramp, and it is just perfectly done. A Detent ball ramp, if you're completely unfamiliar, is a small notch that's cut into the blade like this that allows this Detent ball to glide with less effort up onto the tang. If there is no notch here, then the detent ball has to kind of pop up onto the tang, and that can be difficult. You can make the blade bounce back if you're trying to close it. It can mean that you have to be up onto the tang before you can push the blade closed. These detent ball ramps in general just make it easier to close the knife without kind of hitting that kind of false stop. But they can be done better or worse, and this version is just so well done. What makes a detent ball ramp well done is that it's deep enough in this direction to completely clear the ball at the start of the ramp, and so there's no bump up onto the ramp itself. And then it's long enough in this dimension so that the final angle as you're coming off of the ramp and onto the blade isn't a hard angle. I've talked about this before, but if you have a very short ramp, it's going to have to be steep. And if you look at what my fingers are doing up here, that is a very hard angle. And so if you're pushing a ball up this and it gets to the top, it's going to be like a bump over. The longer you make it, the less steep it becomes. And that means that the amount of force you need to move it along that path is going to be less. If you think about pushing something up a shallow slope versus pushing something up a very steep slope, it's easier. But it also means that this angle at the top is getting closer and closer to being flat. And so the version that they've done here means that you don't hit any bump to get onto the ramp, and you feel absolutely nothing coming off. So this is just, it's just a perfect detent ball ramp. I'm so happy to see that. Okay, let's finally put this together and talk about geometry, because this is where things get interesting. Okay, again, like I said, I have to assemble this in a kind of awkward way to be able to show you this. Let's put this here. Okay, so now you can see that the D shape is down there in the D, and this is a semi-functional knife. What we can see here is how they're hiding this flipper tab. When we open this up, I have to hold this all in place because there's no tension. It starts up here, and the flipper tab is sticking out of this top bit. So to get this flipper tab to be so low in and flush, they've had to cut this handle down some to reveal the actual tab itself. We're going to talk about the consequence of that in just a second. But then as this rotates around, let's see if I can do this without anything popping out. Okay. As we rotate around, we then finally pop into place down here. So there's this notch cut out down here. Oh, I should zoom in for this, shouldn't I? Yeah. Okay, so you see we have this little notch right here that allows the flipper tab to hide below the lock bar, and that is just so good. I love this so much more than had this lock bar come down like it normally would and this entire thing be pivoted out and sticking out the bottom. This is fantastic, but it does come with a couple of consequences. The very first I want to talk about something they actually could have gotten rid of, and that is this little tiny glowing spot right there. Because what that is a wear spot from the flipper tab rubbing. Now, when you get off of the detent ball, there's always that point, whether you're popping off the bottom or running off the bottom of a detent ball ramp, where the blade is now rubbing against the lock bar itself. And ideally, you want to make that as short a period as possible, in part because it's going to talk about where the detent ball engagement is and all that kind of early or late detent, but also it's going to be whether or not you have additional friction in the system as it's opening. Because the more you're rubbing on this bar, the more friction you have. And you can see that that lock bar is indeed rubbing up against that flipper tab as we go. I do think they could have gotten rid of this by simply cutting this a little bit further up. Now that does mean that this wouldn't extend as far up, but reality is it would be really, really pretty minor that they would need to do that. That's right about where this scallop ends anyway. And so this is a super nitpick, but I do think they could have gotten rid of that. But the much, much bigger consequence of hiding the flipper tab under here is that it means that they have to push this entire lock face up higher. And what that impacts is the strength of the lockup. Now, I want to be very, very clear that I am not calling this weak. It is not weak. It is totally, absolutely sufficient for the types of uses this is meant for. This is an EDC knife. And it's like a liner lock, titanium liner lock with a hollow grind that's very, very thin. This was never intended to be a hard use knife, and you should not be using it as a hard use knife. Other things will break before this. But this positioning of this lockup does mean that it's slightly less strong. And so this is a great opportunity to talk about the kind of physics and dynamics going on here and how this all works. So when you talk about a knife's lockup strength, what you're talking about is how much torque can you resist? Because when you try to rotate this blade closed when it's in a locked position, the blade is going to rotate and spin downward this way and apply a force against the lock bar. Now, that lock bar force is going to be in this direction because this lock face is 90 degrees. And so rather than like a bending or twisting force in this way, it's going to be a compressional force into that lock bar, which is going to either try and make the material itself compress into itself or make the lock bar buckle. Now, how much force this lock bar can withstand is a geometry and material thing. The material it's made out of is going to have certain properties in terms of how much it can compress, and the thickness of the lock bar is going to determine how much before it buckles and everything like that. And those things are going to be kind of constant, regardless of where you position it. But where you position it changes the torque that force is able to apply, countering the motion of the blade. Now, people always talk about forces when they're talking about knives, but they should be talking about torques, because all of this is rotational motion about a fulcrum, and torque is force times lever arm distance. So since the force is staying constant, what you really can affect is where that force is applied. And the higher that lever arm distance, the more torque you can resist. So the further you can pull this down, if you make this point here all the way down here instead, this same compressional force that this can withstand is going to be able to resist a higher amount of torque coming into it. Now again, this isn't bad by any means, totally sufficient for this kind of knife, but this is the kind of thing where if you were trying to design a really hard use knife, you wouldn't want to pull this up. You would want to have this as far out as possible. And so this kind of hidden flipper tab, hide it below the bar thing is something that a really hard use knife is not something that they could do, work as a design element. The other impact that this has is how far you can go up does have a limit. Even though this is totally fine for an EDC knife, there is a point where you can't keep pulling it up. And so because if you go above this pivot line, rather than being a compressional force inward, what you start getting is more and more of a rotational force upward. Rather than the force being that way, the force would start pushing up that way, and it'd become a force that twists the bar rather than compresses it. And that's why when you move this all the way up, like you find in a compression lock, you have to have that additional stop pin above it in order to turn that back into a compressional force, compressing the bar against the pin, rather than just that kind of rotating force like that, because it is way, way stronger trying to compress this way than it is to try and twist that way. The other consequence that moving this entire thing upward, or having this lock down here, having this flipper tab down here, is going to impact where you can place this detent ball. If we look at how this was when we had it closed, you can see that this detent ball ramp starts right here. And if we look at it from the outside, you can see that this detent ball ramp, that's that little bit darker spot right there. So they couldn't push this detent ball path any further out without it going into this space right here. But the reason why we care about that is because those same kind of torque conversations about force times lever arm distance apply to the detent ball too, and its overall detent strength. So this again is a torque situation. The further this lever arm is means the more torque that the detent's going to have when it's in the closed position. When people talk about a strong or light detent, they often think about it in terms of force, but they really are talking in terms of torque. And that torque is how strong the leaf springiness of this lock bar is pushing that ball upward, and then the positioning of that ball compared to this pivot point. And so what it means is when you say you're trying to overcome like a certain strength of a detent, it means that you're trying to overcome a certain torque, and you can achieve that same torque either by having a stronger spring or a further lever arm distance. And since the number one source of friction when a knife is closing is how hard this detent ball is pressing against that blade, it means that the further you move this ball out, the lighter you can make this force and the less friction you can have in the knife. Now, this is not by any means a hard to close knife, and it actually drops close with very minor effort. But if you were trying to design a knife that was really, really prioritizing drop shuttiness, then this is, again, the kind of thing where you wouldn't want to have this tab here, because you would want to be trying to push this ball as far out as you possibly can and making this leaf spring as weak as you possibly can in compensation for that. So the last thing I want to talk about in terms of the design of this knife and how that impacts the performance is the location of this smile-shaped stop pin track. on some knives, you'll see this entire thing rotated 90 degrees. It'll start here and end here. In order to do that, you have to extend the blade tang further out this direction in order to have room to accommodate the other half of that arc. By doing it this way and having the entire thing on this side, they're able to keep the amount of metal on this side of the pivot quite small. And what that does is makes this a blade heavy knife. The less metal you have back here, the further your center of gravity is going to be out from on this direction. And the further your center of gravity is out, the more torque gravity is able to apply on it and the more drop shotty your knife is going to be. I kind of want to talk finally, just like my final thoughts on this knife and my overall, and part of that is going to be a big part about the aesthetics of this knife. And I haven't talked about that yet, but they really impact my overall final thoughts, because when I first saw this knife, I thought that does not look like a me knife. And it's funny, I've said before that, that Jake and I have a tremendous amount of overlap in terms of what we look for from the functionality of a knife, but we don't have perfect overlap, or we have a fair bit, but we also have quite a lot that's not in the middle of the Venn diagram in terms of our aesthetics. And when I heard that he was designing a knife, I was like, I wonder where it's going to fall in there. But since I know that he is such a big fan of knives like the PM2, and knives like the Ergos, and I'm one of those rare people that looks at the Ergos and doesn't think that's the prettiest knife. I think that's kind of a weird looking knife. And so when I finally saw this, I had a mixed reaction, because on the one hand, I thought, oh my God, it's so cool that it looks different. I was so used to seeing a wash of bland, monotonous knives. And so to see something that actually looks distinct, even if you can see things that they've clearly pulled from other knives, this package here looks distinct. And so I was really excited that it stood out to me. But I also immediately thought, like, that's not a knife that I would initially say looks beautiful. That's not a me kind of aesthetic. And overall, that's still how I feel about it. I've looked at it a lot, and it's growing on me for sure, because the reality is that when you have it in hand, all of that functionality side is what kicks in. And the more that you look and experience something, the more that you use something and experience how functional it is, the more that you start looking at those design elements as positive. And the more that you look at something as positive, that feeling feels very similar in your brain as being attracted to it. And so it's funny, I've had this not super long, but this knife has already become significantly better looking to me. And I want to be very clear that at no point did I think this was an ugly knife or a bad looking knife. It always very clearly looked to me as like a knife that wasn't my angles, like my typical flow. I tend to like really sleek. I tend to like things like this, or like, yeah. The Waypoint is one of my absolute favorite knives of all time, aesthetically, on top of function. And so since this is a very me knife, and a lot of people look at this and say that this is way too bland almost in how refined it is, since this is my favorite knife, it's not surprising that this is not immediately my aesthetic. But my God, it works so tremendously well that I've really come to love this, and I'm very, very glad that I got one. This is not the knife I would have designed, and that's good, because this is not the knife that I'm not the designer of it. This is something that Jake and Ryan have said unabashedly from the get-go, that this is a knife they designed for them. This is something that they designed to be the perfect knife for them, and if other people loved it, great. The reality is this pre-order sold out. This colorway sold out pretty much immediately, almost. I mean, this is like maybe in an hour, and then the other colorway sold out the same day. And so obviously a lot of other people like it too. But they did this as a passion project for them, design a knife exactly the knife they would want. And since I am someone that likes things more like this styling, and I'm also someone that loves sheep's foots, if I were to go through the same exercise and design exactly the knife I want it to be, it would probably look more sleek, and it would probably be more in the gentleman's folder direction, and it would probably be a sheep's foot or maybe a Wharncliffe. But They also both really like worn sheep's foots and Wharncliffes and are planning on designing more additional knives. But it's also worth noting that, as I should have said at the beginning, it's called Luft Concepts and not Luft Knives because they want to design stuff in general. They don't want to be cornered into just designing knives. But the reality is they're going to make more things. And when I hold this in hand and just see how incredibly well it carries and how well it holds and all these things, it gives me a lot of, I guess, like, excitement and trust that when they do come out with a knife that is in a blade shape that that might be a more me blade shape or something like that, that is going to again be extremely functional. So the other thing I want to talk about in terms of my final thoughts on this is my thoughts on what this means for the industry, because we're at this age now with overseas OEMs that everyday people that have never made a knife themselves can design a knife and get it turned into a real thing. And I've heard some people absolutely rave about this trend, and I've heard some people absolutely loathe it. And it's I think it has both. I think that this trend has some really spectacular elements and has a lot of crap. And the reason is because the barrier entry is so low that people that are talented and put a lot of thought into it can get a knife made for the first time ever. But people that aren't, and the people that are just kind of like making a knife because they thought it'd be fun to make a knife and they don't really think and care how it performs, they just want to make something that looks cool to them, they're also able to make a knife. And so a lot of things that are coming out are just kind of like they're okay, like they don't really need to exist, or they might be totally impractical. And so there, I don't know, we're kind of seeing a swell of these designer knives, as they're being kind of described, that aren't great functional EDC knives. But that low barrier to entry means that folks like Jake and Ryan, who have spent so much time nerding out and thinking about what does make a knife good and functional, mean they can make something like this that they never would have been able to do before. And I will take 10 boring or impractical or dumb knives that don't need to exist that I can just ignore any day if it means that one of these really well-designed knives that should exist can exist in a way that it wouldn't have ever done before. And so I'm incredibly excited about that. Another example, by the way, of like a first-time knife designer that I think is doing great is Tyler TW Price Designs. That's another one. That one is very much a my styling knife compared to this. And that's another case where, like, because this ecosystem exists, someone that has thought a lot about what would make a knife be good has the resource and opportunity to finally make it come to fruition. I'm so excited about that. So I love this era of knives. Even if it comes with some bad, it means we get some amazing things like this. So they will, I know this is all sold out, and but they will be dropping some of these, I believe, through retailers. I believe they said that they were ordering, I think maybe even like 100 on top of the pre-order that would be going to specific select retailers. I don't think they've said anything about who those would be. So I think there will be some available in stock once this is done, and then there will be more. They're definitely going to do other colorways, other blade materials. They'll always probably do something similar to this, but then something maybe branch out. Maybe they'll do like a full tie version, something like that. They're very excited to try other stuff. And since the pre-order did go really well, there will definitely be more of these. But like I said at the beginning, they're also already have been working for a while on other designs. So in addition to being more Avants out there, there will be more knives from Luft Concepts in general. And again, I trust them to make something that will work really, really well. And I'm very excited to see what they come up with. So at the end of the day, I have grown to love this knife. I'm super appreciative that Jake sent me it to check out. And that means a whole lot. And so thank you again. And thank you guys for watching. And yeah, I'll catch you guys next time.